There's an old joke about paranoia, Nick, about something along the lines of just because you're paranoid doesn't mean someone isn't really following you around. It's sort of the inspiration for this new book of yours, Top Secret Alien Abduction Files. You talk about the world in which we live, where mass surveillance is sort of a given now, right?
Well, unfortunately, yeah, and of course, for subsequent generations, they'll grow into a world where they've never known any different. For people of a certain age, before the internet age, will remember that there was not that sort of worldwide surveillance that we have now, and I think that's one of the unfortunate things for future generations. It's going to be a totally normal thing for them, and probably accepted as well.
You mentioned in the book about the idea, the fear that people used to have that maybe the government's going to talk us into getting a computer chip stuck under our skin, and then they can follow us, and it'll be for all the good reasons, for our health and well-being and all kinds of ways. But in effect, they would be able to monitor everything we do, everything about us. We already have a surveillance device like that. We all carry them. They're cell phones.
Yep.
But the idea that our government, that the UK government, other governments around the world would put time and resources into not only investigation of these phenomena, UFOs, things of that sort, alien abductions, but would monitor, intimidate, follow alien abductees, whether or not the government understands what alien abductions are all about. That idea would seem preposterous to many, but you make the case in this book that it's real and ongoing, right?
Yes. I mean, the reason why I wrote the book, which actually the official publication date is the 1st of November, but people can already get it. But the reason I wrote Top Secret Alien Abduction Files was because over the years I collected a number of official documents on abductions which have been declassified through the Freedom of Information Act in the UK and the US. And finally I was in a position where I could actually sort of put the book together and, provide the reader with, yes, it's another book on alien abductions, but instead of going just over old ground, why not present people with the data showing how files have been put together? Now, I start the book actually with the contactee movement of the 1950s, which preceded the abduction phenomenon by just over about 10 years or so. And the reason I did that was to demonstrate to people from the word go, so to speak, that government agencies do put together files on people who claim to have had alien encounters. For example, just about all of the contactees of the 1950s, like George Adamski, George Van Tassel, Truman Bethlehem, Orfeo Angelucci, all of them had FBI files opened on them. One of the main reasons being was because they claimed when interviewed by the FBI that, yes, they claimed they had these experiences with aliens, but they told the FBI that the aliens had a government or governments very different to ours and bordering on communism. And so that really opened the eyes of the FBI to the extent that, for example, George Van Tassel's FBI file is extremely extensive. It's like about an inch thick. George Adamski's is about 150 pages. Orfeo Angelucci's was about 40, and so on. So, we have a precedent for the abduction phenomenon with the contactee people. Now, in the early 60s, things really kicked off with the alien abduction phenomenon in September 61 with the Betty and Barney Hill case, which is the defining moment in ufology, when it wasn't the first abduction case on record, but it was certainly the one that really opened people's eyes when John Fuller wrote his book on the case, The Interrupted Journey. Now, in the story of Betty and Barney Hill, they're coming back from a vacation in Canada. They see this strange light in the sky, and then things kind of get weird. They don't feel right. Everything seems a bit surreal and strange. And they get back home, and then they start having these weird dreams and nightmares of being taken on board this strange craft with equally strange creatures. and being subjected to strange and intrusive experiments. Now, what's particularly intriguing is that I found a file in the British National Archive, and it revolved around a man named Ronald Wildman, who was delivering a vehicle in the south of England, and it was like the early hours of the morning, about 2 a.m., and as he was driving this vehicle to the location, the lights on the car went out, and the car stuttered and came to a halt. And this has become known as the vehicle interference phenomenon within ufology. What's intriguing is that the British police force actually handed over the investigation, because he reported it to the police. They handed it over to a group within the British Royal Air Force called the Provost and Security Services, who are sort of like the James Bond, if you like, of the Royal Air Force. They sort of get involved in espionage and counterintelligence, things like that. What's interesting is that in the file, it talks about how the Provost and Security Services interviewed Ronald Wildman about this encounter with the car came to a halt and this UFO was in front of him. And the most telling and intriguing aspect is that he told the police, and this is a direct quote, that he was muddled about the time, which is an interesting thing, because that sort of sounds just like, the whole missing time angle of abduction law in today's world. But Ronald Wildman, in the file, it actually refers to him saying that, yes, he saw this UFO come down, the lights went out of his vehicle, and then he kind of felt a bit strange, checked his watch, and there was something about it. It's not actually, portrayed completely in the file, but it says he was muddled about the time, which I think, you put all those aspects together, that has the potential for being a significant abduction case.
I think about the contactees, and I remember reading about them when I first got into this subject and thinking sort of with bemusement, well, they were interesting, colorful, harmless sort of weirdos. But the more you read about them, the more interesting they become, of course, people like Adamski. Then when you realize that these guys telling these crazy stories, some of them would say, they met these women and went to Venus and things like that, and you have a hard time taking them literally. But when you realize that the government really does follow them around and takes it seriously for whatever reason, it makes me think of like the Robertson panel, where the CIA scientists study the UFO topic and they conclude the UFOs themselves are not a threat to national security, but reporting UFOs might be, because maybe the Russians could somehow manipulate public opinion. Is that a justification for following around people like Adamski, Bethlehem, those folks?
Oh, yeah, because, George Adamski's first book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, published in the early 50s, that sold in huge figures. Gigantic numbers of books were sold. And Adamski went on the lecture circuits all around the country, and he was talking about how the aliens supposedly had this sort of communist type of government, and that communism was the way of the future. And the FBI opened their file on Adamski predominantly because he was someone, talking about a controversial subject, namely UFOs and contact with aliens, but the FBI was more concerned as to how people reading his books and going to his lectures might be influenced by this communist angle. And a number of the contactees had sort of similar approaches. For example, again in the UK, you have the Aetherius Society created by George King. That was closely watched by the British police force, because George King and the Aetherius Society were very much anti-nuclear weapons, and so files were opened on them. So, in other words, yes, we have files opened on the contactees, but predominantly because they had this political slant in many of their claims. But the important thing is, at the end of the day, what it boils down to is that the FBI and the other agencies were opening surveillance files on people who claimed close encounters with non-human entities.
You report in the book that's coming out the 1st of November, Top Secret, Alien Abduction Files, you report something that I hadn't read before. It's about a very famous case, Antonio Villas-Boas. This is an abduction case in which the guy had reported that he had sex with an alien female, and I'd never heard this new explanation, but it takes the government surveillance to a whole different level. Tell that story.
Well, yeah, this is a strange one. I mean, the conventional aspect, if you can call it a conventional aspect of the story, goes back to the 50s, and it's a famous case from Brazil where this young man named Antonio Villas-Boas claimed to have been taken on board a UFO, and as you said, he had sex with this beautiful-looking alien woman, and for all intents and purposes, he was taken on board against his will. So he was abducted. You know, it was an alien abduction case. And within ufology, you know, it's either perceived as being wishful thinking on the part of Antonio Villas-Boas, or, you know, it was a really weird aspect of the phenomenon. Now, there's this little known aspect to this story which places an entirely different slant on it all. Now, if you read carefully Antonio Villas-Boas's report that he put together for a Brazilian UFO researcher and a doctor named Olavo Fontes, he talks about how this craft that he was taken on board came down, and he started to feel weird, as if he'd been drugged somehow. And he said he was taken aboard this craft, which he described as being sort of long and rectangular, and he had like something on top, like a dish that was spinning around very fast, and it was making a beating noise. Now that kind of sounds not unlike a helicopter, you know, the shape, the spinning disc on top of the rotors, and the beating noise sounds like the classic sound you get with a helicopter. Now, a man came forward in the late 1970s, but his story didn't get very much publicity. His name was Bosko Nedeljkovic, and he had ties to the CIA and various other agencies. And he told a UFO researcher, Rich Reynolds, of what he said was the real story, namely that the abduction was a fabrication, and that it really did involve a helicopter, that they targeted Villas-Boas. He was out working in the field late at night, and they released some sort of hallucinogenic aerosol, which incapacitated him, took him on board the helicopter, and a woman was really there, and the part was played out. But he was in a sort of an altered state, wasn't sure what was going on, and then was then sort of unceremoniously dumped back on the ground. And the theory or the story was that the agencies within governments, there may well have been real abductions, but they were also fabricating abductions to try and determine how, bear in mind this was the 50s, like with the CIA's MK Ultra and things like this. The plan was to try and determine to what extent the human mind could be altered. And, you know, in other words, if we can convince people they can see aliens, we can convince them of anything. That was basically what it came down to. So Nedeljkovic claimed that the abduction, if you like, was played out, and they kind of just then sat back and waited to see how much of the story was taken in, and when they realized that the story had been embraced by ufology and it was appearing in books, it was a case of a job well done, you know.
Makes you wonder, you know, you have several examples of these pretty well-documented abduction cases where the principal targets think that it's something beyond just some alien presence, that there's military or government involvement.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets confusing. If there are genuine alien abductions, and then you have agencies fabricating them to try and determine how the human mind can be altered, and they use the UFO angle as the motif to try and, to see how it works on people or doesn't work. So, it gets really confusing when there could be real abductions and fabricated ones as well.
It makes you wonder, I mean, is it possible there are agencies that are investigating the abductees, messing with them, following them around, listening to their phones, but not investigating the abductions themselves, the phenomena itself? Or are they doing both and just not telling us?
Well, yeah, I think there's good evidence that it's actually both, because in some of the abductees that I spoke with said that on a number of occasions they'd actually been visited by military personnel, and it wasn't like a traumatic, threatening MIB situation. It was more that these military personnel were actually approaching the abductees quietly, requesting that they didn't talk about their experiences, and some of them didn't, and some of them have. But they basically, it was as if the military were asking questions along the lines of, well, can you give us some insight as to why this is being done? So in other words, they were trying to get to the heart of what the abductions were and why they were being done. But in other cases, there is good evidence also of surveillance of the abductees. A good example, and somebody who's tied to Coast, Greg Bishop. Greg told me how he had a period of correspondence in the 1990s with Dr. Carla Turner, who wrote a number of good books on abductions, and she was an abductee herself. And Greg told me how, back in the early 90s, sort of pre-internet era, all of the letters that they wrote to each other back and forth were opened and sealed back down with tape. And now this can clearly be done, easily without making it look like the envelope was torn open and resealed. It was almost as if whoever was doing this wanted Greg and Carla Turner to know that someone was opening their mail. In other words, it was sort of like an intimidation. Hey, we're watching you. And that went on, for quite a period.
Greg is working tonight as our webmaster, by the way. So, I saw his name. I was going to mention that in the book and ask you about it. There are a lot of people in the UFO field who, are not as credible as Greg, who are sure that the government's watching him. And I'm not sure I believe all of them. I believe him, though, if he says it.
Well, I think sometimes, that there's no doubt that if you have a traumatic experience like an alien abduction, then I think sometimes people can become sort of paranoid of every little thing in their life, which is a dangerous road to go down. But in saying that, another example is the whole issue of black helicopters, which I think many people associate them with cattle mutilations. The black helicopter phenomenon is clearly a real one, and it does seem to be tied to both cattle mutilations and the alien abduction phenomenon. One of the things that has been noticed, and I think there's probably some truth to this, is the idea that whoever's flying these helicopters potentially, I think, is part of an organization that operates outside of government. It may sort of do research and work for the government, but it's not, like the CIA or anybody like that flying the helicopters, I don't think. I think it is sort of, almost like a black budget kind of program designed to do the work. And most people in government don't know anything about it at all, because it may not actually operate under the regular confines of the government itself. It may have been even sort of farmed out to private corporations, which again would make it more difficult to get material through the Freedom of Information Act when you're dealing with private corporations which aren't covered by the Freedom of Information requests. So in that sense, I think, the phenomenon is real, and I think whether it's cattle mutilations or abductions, the goal seems to be surveillance to try and figure out what's going on. There's so many cases of black helicopters and unmarked helicopters turning up near the homes, sometimes precariously near the homes of alien abductees. And again, kind of like with Carla Turner and Greg, this might be a degree of intimidation, but also it may be an attempt to just keep an eye on the abductees and be able to respond at high speed if in the event that the people flying the helicopters were actually able to catch an abduction going ahead, in the process at that very time.
Somebody who's tuning in tonight for the first time has to think we're all crazy. Alien abductions, cattle mutilations, black helicopters, and we're saying, yeah, this stuff happens. But the files that you've obtained from the U.S. government, from the U.K. government, sheds light on these things, that someone takes it seriously. Maybe the scariest part of this is that there isn't anyone who really knows what's going on, that there are agencies, different agencies in government, small groups of people who are looking at this, but really don't have answers about who's responsible and why this stuff happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, George, because, I mean, government agencies don't always know what another agency knows. In many cases, agencies keep the information to themselves unless it needs to be shared. And if we're dealing with, as I said, a group that actually isn't technically part of the government, but the work's farmed out to, private companies and things like that, that's going to make it even more difficult. But I mean, in terms of the files on the black helicopters, I've probably got about 300 or 400 pages. So that includes the FBI's declassified files on cattle mutilations, a wave of encounters that occurred in '75 in some of near the northern border of the United States in the latter part of '75. And just various other cases, including some from the UK, when there was a wave of activity of UFOs in '73, and there was also a wave of black helicopters in the same areas. So I think we're seeing a pattern, and I think surveillance and intimidation are sort of the main calling cards that, explain why they're flying around.
Trying to figure out what's going on, whether these abductees' experiences are literally physically real or not. It's tough to, even though there are some really well-documented cases, it's tough to figure it out. It's tough to figure out what someone else is looking for when they put people through this stuff. You bring up Bob Lazar in the book, and I should mention that there's a film coming out about Lazar. It'll be the 30th anniversary of when that story first came out. Jeremy Corbell's got it coming out in December, and then there's a book that's going to be published, I think, after the first of the year. So a lot of interest in the case, but your angle was kind of an interesting one on how it fits into the whole abductee alien scenario.
Well, yeah, I mean, Lazar's story has always intrigued me. I know a lot of people dismiss it outright, but one of the things I've always found about Lazar is that unlike a lot of people who hoax things in ufology, when the story runs out of fuel, they suddenly add a new angle to it so they can get back on the lecture circuit and so on. And I think that the big difference with Lazar is he never embroidered on the original story. He told it as it was. He's never expanded on it. He tells the same stories he did 30 years ago. He's hardly tried to put himself at the forefront of ufology and, pulling in however many, dollars and so forth. He doesn't, regardless of the controversial nature of the story, he doesn't come across like your average hoaxer. So that's one of the things that's always intrigued me. But, in relation to the book, I talk about the connections between the abductions and people who claim that in some way or another the greys, the alien greys who do the abductions, that somehow they have this deep and sort of sinister and disturbing interest in the human soul. And this sort of ties in with Lazar when he claimed that he was given a bunch of briefing papers to read out at S4, this portion of Area 51 he was working at, allegedly. And he said that the aliens, or whatever they are, viewed us as containers, and he speculated on the possibility of containers of souls. In other words, as if the Greys had some sort of obsessive interest in the human soul. And one of the things I talk about in the book is a number of abductees who were approached clandestinely by these military agencies or private corporations, asked questions about, did you have any dreams afterwards of your body, of your soul leaving your body? Did you have any sort of like a religious conversion after the abduction? Really weird questions, but some of the questions kind of dovetailed with this story that Lazar was telling as well.
You know, you look at recent developments in regard to the UFO topic in general. And of course, we've been told since 1969, the U.S. military, the Air Force, they stopped Project Blue Book. They're not studying it. It's no threat to national security. We don't care. We're not looking at it. And now, of course, you know, I don't know that anyone ever really believed that, but that was the cover story. And now we've learned in the last 10 months that wasn't true, that there were ongoing studies. There was more than one, in fact, that they were collecting information on what seems like, you know, presumably is a ridiculous topic. In light of the kind of files that you bring up in this book, where there's surveillance and there's counterintelligence and there's, disinformation and things of that sort, do you have concerns about the recent revelations? I would think that people who are suspicious and are wary of this, you know, there's some history behind why they need to be careful.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it is such a confusing angle, George, you know, this angle of real abductions, fabricated abductions, the surveillance, the government itself trying to get its head around what's going on. You know, you put all this together and, it really is sort of a difficult area in which to work to try and figure out, you know, what's true, what isn't, or is it somewhere between the two, you know, and again, that's why, you know, the way I've written the book is to demonstrate what we know versus, you know, what we're speculating on as to why the government or an agency may be doing this. Why might they be fabricating an abduction event, but then at the same time also investigating a legitimate event? You know, it's nowhere, being just black and white. You know, it's the lines are really blurred in trying to figure out what the overall goal is. But there is no doubt at all that, you know, that there is sort of extensive surveillance of abductees.
Yeah, it's right out of the X-Files. Everything is gray, nothing black and white. Nick, I don't know when you sleep, but you are as prolific an author as I know in the world. Want to talk about anything else you got coming up? We got about a minute left.
Well, as I said, you know, that's the new book, Top Secret Alien Abduction Files. That's the one I'm sort of, promoting now. And as I said, the reason I wanted to write it was because, yes, there have been a lot of books written on abductions, but not a book that sort of actually addresses freedom of information files on everything from abductions to missing time to black helicopters. You know, it presents a new angle on the abduction issue, if you like.
Thank you, Nick. It's always great to have you here. I want to urge people to take a look at the new book and also the monster book. It's a great one to have for your library if you're interested in these kind of subjects. Always good to have you here. Thank you, Nick.